That's not what I want. Pooper. Pooper a trooper. Hi, Stacy Lynn. I'm doing okay. How are you? How are things? How's the stuff? Oh, nice. Fabulous that you got the day off. Love that for you. And of course, being lazy is always acceptable on a day off. Just trying to find some art for um, for the dig deep that I'm doing. So we'll see what happens. There you go. Don't complain about it at all. Damn it. Yeah. Not marble. I did not want marble. Hello, Ember. How are you, beautiful? here we go. This is probably what I'm looking for right here. Assets, logos, and images. There we go. Accept that. Agree to this. A hint of what is to come. There we go. Wee bit of a hint there. Better tell my love that I am live, or else my love will miss out that I'm live. Yeah. Ha ha, hee hee, ho 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 ho. Alright. Yeah, we're gonna have a little fun with this too. Why not? Because, as we say, I don't know what we say. I'm just rambling at the moment, waiting for things to load up and go. Doop doop doopy 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 doop boop doopy 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 doop 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 doopy doopy doop 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 doop. Yo. Oh, so bright and early Monday morning, all of the excitement of a new week. Yeah, there's not too many people in here, yay. Whee! Well, I've got less action today than normal. And that's saying a hell of a lot. So, I'm either dead on the net or not interesting enough to really even get the trolls engaged. That's sad. That's not the right one. Nope, that's not the right one. Brown again. Blue or purple. I'm not sure which. There's a black. I'll use it if I need to. Purple. No. 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 Damn, it disappeared. Is that it? No, that's blue. There it is. Haha, found it. You can't go out in public and you can't be employed, so social media is all you have. So Timmy, why can't I go out in public? Hi, baby. Little Timmy here says, I can't go out in public, and I'm just curious why I can't go out in public. Ding! That's why trans are all over social media, but never in public. So, why? Fear? What are we afraid of? Hi, Lisa. Long time no see, sweetie. I hear you. You gotta do those. Etc. Timmy, I'm not really sure what you were saying because your comments disappeared. So if you could kind of drop back in and let me know what those comments were. Casey Marie, how are you, love? You make your life so hard. How do I make my life hard? Timmy, you're really good at making claims, but you're not really substantiating. I don't have any words blocked. Believe it or not, I don't. Trying to find an Airbnb in Texas. What? What? I forgot to do my lipstick. And I'll need it for my hair too. Well, Timmy, let's use some critical thinking here. I'm not deleting anything. I don't have a filter that has any word. I don't have any words filtered. And if my mods were silencing you, your entire conversation would be gone and you wouldn't be able to communicate. So who does that leave that could possibly be filtering your content? I'm asking you to use critical thinking. I'm not doing anything. My mods can only mute users. They cannot remove comments. And in addition, let me do this. I'm going to move the comments right here. If you can see your comment in this box, I can see your comment. If you cannot see your comment in this box, I cannot see your comment. Z-Man, how are you? So, Timmy, I don't know if you understand how this works. TikTok uses an AI algorithm to screen lives and chat. They use an AI as a first line of filtering to make sure that comments are not harmful to the community, okay? Mods are only called in when there is a significant dispute involving the chat community. That's what I'm talking about. The mods only get involved if there is a direct complaint about something. That is how the app works. They do not use direct human moderators, and even for the moderators they do have, they're not all located in Los Angeles. They have centers in various states. Do I know anyone? No, I do not. Believe me, I'm not that important. I'm just a simple content creator like others. You know, I don't rub shoulders with the bigwigs. I mean, I know some people who do have contact with them, but I do not. No, there are actually offices and service centers in multiple states. right, good luck with that, Timmy. I hope you all the best in finding what you're looking for. You're curious about what? All right, I can expand on the genocide. So first of all, let me restore some items. Okay, you can't restore that. You have to reload it. All right, so let's go ahead and pop over here. Okay. So, first of all, when we talk about genocide, and I'm not talking about genocidal, events right now. I'm talking about genocide as a category. The definition of genocide in the global courts is based on these definitions from the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Now, this was ratified in 1948, which was just shortly after the founding of the United Nations. The United Nations signed off and agreed to a Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in 1948, and this has been the standard of defining a genocide in the world since then. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And there are 5 different types of crimes that are identified. The killing of members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, these are the 5 crimes of genocide identified by the United Nations. And in terms of this convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part. The intent is what defines it as a genocide. So if any of these 5 things are happening with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a group that shares a common identity, it is a genocidal crime. Are you with me so far there, whoever asked? Okay. So, most people use number 1 right here as the only definition of a genocide. They go to the Merriam-Webster and they look at the dictionary. But when we're talking about a global community crime of genocide, we go to the United Nations to see what their standards are. This is only one of 5 forms of genocidal crimes. In terms of the others, many times people overlook them and they don't want to address these. But we do take into account that the United Nations has already said that if any one of these things is happening, a genocide is happening. As of right now, within the United States, 4 of these 5 crimes are being committed. Number 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Mental harm is just as real and traumatic as physical harm. In fact, the bodies within our system cannot distinguish the difference between the trauma of physical harm and the trauma of mental harm or emotional harm. Our bodies respond to that in the very same ways. So, causing serious bodily or mental harm is inflicting trauma on a group of people. When people are intentionally doing that, because of the identity of that group of people, when that harm is done to a group of people because of their very identity, this is happening. And as we look at what has happened in the United States over the last 5 years, we have seen significant mental harm within results of psychiatric and psychological evaluation within the transgender community. And we have only seen that trauma, that mental harm, increase over the course of the last 5 years, and we've not seen the end of it yet. We have not seen the end of that harm that is being done. So we are seeing this. We've also seen the violence done to transgender people increase over the last 5 years. We have seen that number increase, and because we are such a small demographic, any increase needs to be considered. All right? Any increase needs to be considered and examined. And when I do my news stories, I do talk about events wherein someone who is identified as transgender is the victim of violence specifically because of their identity. So, this crime is happening right now. When you take into account the Republican Party calling us groomers and pedophiles, when you have groups of people who are, saying that we are a threat to women, we are a threat to children, that we are a threat to society as we know it, when you have an attitude that is growing like that, and you have multiple groups that are joining in on that message, you have Republicans, you have conservative evangelical fundamentalist Christians, you have white supremacists, you have radical feminists, you have radical gays who are all joining in on that message with no substantiation of that. There is no substantiation of the claims that they make. The per capita criminal incident rate of transgender people is among the lowest identifying markers of people. But when it comes to predatory behaviors, when it comes to violence against women and children, you can damn sure bet that white, cisgender, heterosexual men are at the top of that category. Yet, we are such a threat that we deserve to have bodily or mental harm directed at us. We are a threat to these people. If you look over on the steps, the process steps of genocide, this is what's known as dehumanization. Dehumanization is associating a group of people with some form of activity, behavior, or quality that makes them less than human. In most societies around the world, especially within the United States, pedophiles are ranked as the lowest members of society. In terms of the criteria and the caste system, if somebody is identified as a pedophile, they are defined to be the worst within society. And if you look at American society across the board, conservative, progressive, traditional, liberal, any of those, identifying places, when you look at it, pedophiles are ranked among the lowest of society. Transgender people are ranked with pedophiles. With no substantiated proof, just because of our identity and our existence, they identify us with pedophiles. I have a story that I'm going to report on tonight where, the discussion of a clothing line has a t-shirt that features the now public domain image of Mickey Mouse in his Steamboat Willie era. And he is connected with the talking point that has come out over the last couple of years with regard to transgender people of, execute a pedophile. So you have Mickey Mouse being used to promote that agenda, that attitude. When transgender people are associated with pedophiles who are already classified as the worst among humanity, subhuman by many people's standards, and there is no direct reason why, then you are talking about inflicting intentional mental harm, and if some people take that to the extreme, which people have been known to do, it causes bodily violence. This crime is being committed in the United States. Number 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. There are a lot of people who love to quote at me that I'm a part of the 42%. Do you know what the 42% references? That one day I'm going to join the 42% because I'm a transgender person. That 42% is a direct reference to suicidal activities, attempts. And what we have seen through surveys and documentation of medical, examinations and postmortems, we have seen that suicide attempts and completions are growing in the United States. We have seen that the number of transgender identified people who either attempt or complete suicide has been tracking upward. And even though we bring these statistics to legislators, we say, look, your legislation and your rhetoric leads directly to the increase in this number. The legislation and the rhetoric of politicians directly links to the rise in suicidal attempts. So they are going to be intentional in making legislation and creating more legislation, as we have seen over the last 3 years and coming into this year. From 2020 to right now, we have seen legislation inch up and sometimes make a gigantic leap, like it did between 2022 and 2023, when we went to right around 300 bills to almost 600 bills. And as of right now, sitting here this morning, $467 bills have been introduced in the United States in 41 states today, as of right now. So, when we are talking about the deliberate inflicting of conditions of life, we are looking at legislative efforts, right? They are deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life. 467 bills that have been introduced that directly relate to transgender people. 467 bills that in some way address the condition of life that we have here in the United States. Whether that is medical care, whether that is being in public, whether that is education settings, whether that is representation in media, our condition of life is being impacted by the legislation. So it is deliberately inflicted, meaning that legislation, which has increased every year for the last 3 years, has been increased in order to continue to impact the conditions of life of transgender people. And when we take into account that it's calculated, meaning that we have psychologists, we have sociologists, we have, medical doctors, we have people who come in and report, here is what we are seeing in our therapies environments. Here's what we are seeing in terms of surveys of people groups. Here's what we're seeing in the emergency rooms. Conditions of life that are calculated, meaning that these legislators know that there is a direct correlation between the increase in legislation and the increase in suicidal activity. It is calculated to bring about physical destruction in whole or in part. So basically, 42% is what they consider to be acceptable losses. The legislative effort, the effort to pass these bills has been directly correlated to suicidal activity, but legislators believe that a 42% suicidal activity rate is acceptable losses. I don't really have anything more specific to give you to think about that for just a minute. The correlation between the increase in legislation and the increase in suicidal activity has shown an increase in legislation, an increase in suicidal activity. And they have been told in committee meeting after committee meeting and documentation after documentation that this is causing suicidal activities. And yet, there are more bills to come. Number 4, the imposing of measures intended to prevent births within the group. Transgender people are people, which means that some of us want to have kids. Some of us want to be able to get pregnant. Some of us want to be able to, raise kids that are our own. And we are told that, if we continue to go through the process of medical transition, that the likelihood of infertility is almost guaranteed. So, we have been working over the last 10 to 15 years to remove the requirement of updating our information, our gender, our identities with, state governments, with federal government. We have been working to remove the requirement of having to have surgery See, there were numerous states that had bills that required surgical procedures on your primary sexual characteristics before you could have your identity updated. That requirement, therefore, presents a barrier to producing kids. There are now states that are trying to bring those surgical requirements back. For example, the state of Utah just passed a bill into a law that requires surgical gender-affirming care to verify a transgender person's ability to be in the bathroom that associates with their identity. Meaning that if I, as a transgender woman, wanted to use the bathroom in Utah, I would have to give proof, documented proof, that I had had genital reassignment as a part of my gender transition. Now, I'm 53 years old. I have two great kids that they are genetically a part of me, and they are amazing, and, they are adults now, and they're living their own lives, and, it really is wonderful to have my kids that I have been a part of their life from the very beginning. Transgender people have the right to be able to do that. Transgender people have the right to be able to have their own kids, bring them into this world, and raise them. But imposing measures such as you must have genital reassignment surgery as part of your gender affirmation is imposing measures that would prevent births within the group. The requirement to have genital reassignment surgery as part of my gender transition just to go to the bathroom in Utah. If I were a 19 or 20 or 21-year-old who had not yet, found someone and gotten married and had kids, but I was a transgender person, in order to go into a women's bathroom, I would have to give proof of genital reassignment surgery. Just to go to the bathroom. So, number 4 is happening in the U.S. It's not the surgeries that are the crime, it is imposing measures that are the crime. It's the passing of legislation that is the crime. Number 5, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And here is where we see probably the greatest example of this. because you have states that are enacting laws that declare gender-affirming care as child abuse. Those laws then put the families in a position that if they're providing gender-affirming care, they are charged with child abuse. Their child is taken from them and put within the child welfare system of the state. But in Florida, they went one step further. Not only is gender-affirming care declared to be childhood, but even association between transgender and cisgender family members is enough to have the state take a child on a complaint. If a child has a cisgender set of parents, but they are transgender, a complaint can have that child removed from those parents. If you have a cisgender child that has a transgender parent, a complaint can be filed and that child can be removed. If a cisgender child has a transgender sibling or aunt or uncle who is in close association with the family, that child can be removed. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group is akin to legal kidnapping. And I am pointing out that within the United States, we have 2 states that have already tried to institutionalize laws that would allow the seizing of children who are transgender or who are related to transgender people. Wyoming has another law just now that has been introduced that would take children away from parents if they are receiving gender-affirming care, because that is not in the best interest of the child. For genocidal crimes being committed in the United States right now. But if you want to really drive the point home, the 10th process step of genocide, the 10th step of the process is identified as denial. Meaning that if something is happening, if there is any one of these taking place, and it is surrounded by denial, that's not happening. That isn't what is going on. You are making this up. If denial surrounds that, then we are watching at least the process of denial related to genocidal crimes taking place. Now, if you can find all of the process steps in relationship to these crimes, or if you can find the majority of them, you either have a genocidal event happening, or you have a genocidal event that is at least being avoided. Classification. We classify and separate ourselves into different identities. Symbolization. Attaching some form of symbol to that identity. Discrimination, the effort to take the group that is identified together and begin to push them into a sense of you're not one of the other group. Dehumanization, the identifying of that group and attaching to them acts, behaviors, or qualities that reduce them below the identity of humanity. Organization, there are groups coming together, working together to make sure that that group that has been identified is somehow the focus of an effort. Polarization, the idea that they are evil, they are wrong, they are in somehow a threat to society, and society as a whole needs to be protected from them. Preparations, putting things in place so that as the group is focused and targeted on, then it becomes easier to put pieces into place for, number 8, persecution. The intentional effort to inflict upon that people qualities of life, conditions of life that are specifically targeting their identity. And then you have 9, the process of extermination. The process of extermination is not just killing people, but it is in fact putting things in place so that deaths and quality of life deaths go up, quality of life goes down, so that we then see either suicidal activity increase or we see criminality increase to the point of legal executions. See, genocide is not as easy as there's a bunch of people that were killed. And since 1948, it never has been. Since 1948, the definition of the crime of genocide involves any of these 5. And I have clearly lined out 4 of these acts were happening in the United States right now. Conspiracy eyes, that is not exactly the same, but it is a part of number 2 and number 3. You know, it's not completely the effort. There is no homicidal intent, but there is definitely causing bodily and mental harm, but also imposing, conditions of life calculated that bring about the destruction, the ending of one's life. Carly, what is the thing that a national group, an ethnic group, a racial group, or a religious group, what do they all have in common? It goes a little broader than that. If we're talking about a national group, we're talking about a group of people who are identified as being citizens of a nation. An ethnic group shares ethnic qualities and traits that separate them as part of their identity. A racial group shares qualities and features that connects them together in a shared identity. A religious group shares a belief system that brings them together as part of their identity that separates them from other people. Sure, we can say that gender and sexuality are not listed here. But if we are talking about the definition of a group being a group of people that share a common identity, traits, qualities, characteristics of a shared identity, then we are talking about how this law applies, how this convention applies. Because race extends be ethnicity and race and religion all extend beyond national borders. Ethnicity is defined by sociology, the examining of a group to find out what sort of bonds that group has. Anthropology, sociology. A race is typically defined by chromosomal manifestations within, parts of the body. A religion is bound together by a group of religious tenets. So it is not that much to imagine that a sub-organization of gender which technically would fall under ethnicity in a sociological form, because in gender we have tribal alignments. Okay, in the sense that we cluster based on that shared identity within our ethnicity. But more importantly, we have this shared identity of saying our gender does not match our natal sex identification. That is a shared quality. That is a part of who we are. You're very welcome. Now, apologists, people who want to define things literally and explicitly based on what is written without understanding the meaning of it, the significance of it, they're going to say, well, you're not a nation, you're not an ethnicity, you're not a race, you're not a religious group. Therefore, yeah, there's no holds barred. But if we are human beings, and I don't mean transgender people, I mean all of us, if we are human beings, and we have just a hint of compassion for other human beings, then any group of people that would be targeted, it doesn't matter where they're from, who they're related to, how they look, or what they believe. If any group of people tied together by some shared identity is the target of any one of these 5 things, then as human beings, we should be willing to step up and say, no, not again. And that brings me to my deep dive. The deep dive for today is a hoot. Yeah, bear with me as I take you into the world of nerdy goodness. No, not, I want window capture, there we go. All right, folks, here we go. The deep dive today. Right-wing snowflakes. Oops. Go back down. Right-wing snowflakes. And this is from, is this LGBTQ Nation? No, this is Pink News. Right-wing snowflakes and baffled bigots rage at Disney for making X-Men character non-binary. Now, if you are a kid of the 90s, you may have remembered the X-Men animated series. Well, Disney is bringing the X-Men animated series back. And one of the characters that was introduced within that series, a character by the name of Morph, has been recently identified by the people behind the X-Men as a non-binary character. Set to hit the screens on March 20th exclusively on Disney Plus, X-Men 97 promises to pick up the narrative thread left hanging by the original cartoon, with the mutant team grappling with the apparent demise of Charles Xavier, as people who are less familiar with the cartoon version like to call him, played by Patrick Stewart. The trailer opens with a vigil for Xavier, and then the X-Men are met with a shock as Magneto appears, complete with flowing white hair, bearing a last will and testament that puts Xavier's students and schools under the control of Magneto. In an issue of Empire magazine focusing on X-Men 97, brief character profiles are given for several of the returning characters from the original X-Men animated series. Speaking to Empire magazine, showrunner Bo DeMayo revealed that X-Men 97 will feature a lighter take on the character Morph, who is non-binary and has an interesting buddy relationship with Wolverine. So, binary was actually the adaptation of a character from the X-Men comics, originally named Changeling, a mutant shapeshifter. In the comics, the character was reintroduced as Morph in the 1990s for the X-Men the Animated Series, wherein the character becomes a part of the X-Men team. Now, the character was introduced as comic relief, but the character didn't make a comic book appearance until much later. Now, the interesting thing about Morph is that Morph is a changeling, a shapeshifter, taking on different appearances. And we find here in this description, that Morph is a hero from Earth 1081 who was a member of the New Mutants, X-Men, and Avengers. He was a unique son of loving parents. Early on in life, he managed to use his powers and was able to give everyone what they wanted for him. Morph always used his power to joke around and keep everyone at ease, only comfortable to be himself around his parents. His mother died of lung cancer, and Morph tried in every way to cheer up his emotionally distraught father, often acting in childish way whenever his father wanted him to act serious, who, unable to let his suffering go, chose to enroll his son in a boarding school. Luckily, that school happened to be the Xavier Institute for Higher Learning. That character could morph into any other character. He can morph into any other person. The idea of a changeling, the idea of a shapeshifter, was the idea that they could take on the appearance of anyone, and that there were no limits in terms of things like racial traits, ethnic traits, ability traits in terms of arms, legs, but also gender and sex. Morph could take on the appearance of someone of the opposite sex, which means that in all definition, Morph was non-binary from the very beginning. Morph was a non-binary character in the 1990s episodes, because he was not linked, he was not tied into one set of a binary. whether it was black versus white in terms of skin color and tone, or it was male versus female in terms of sexual identification, or it was, abled versus disabled. There was no singular identity that Morph had to fit. So he was a non-binary character because of his powers. Now, again, conservatives are just all up in arms because what should be obvious isn't. What should be obvious to anyone who can critically think is that someone who can change their identity through an innate power is not necessarily required to be any one identity. That should be common knowledge. Now, let's take for a moment the fact that this is a fictional comic book superhero mutant character. Let's throw out the fact that we are dealing with conservatives getting their proverbial panties in a knot over a comic book character. There's no real reason why this should be an issue, because the character is being true to itself. The character is a non-binary character by the very nature of being a changeling, a shapeshifter. Marvel has played around with this concept of shapeshifters quite a bit, to where we had people like Morph, Mystique, Cloud, Hulkling. You have these characters who are able, you have these Skrulls, for God's sake. You have an entire race that's primary ability is to take on the appearance of others. So Marvel has constantly had this theme of playing with the binaries. What is coming to the forefront right now, though, is the argument is, was this intentional? Are characters like Morph and Mystique, the character of Angel, the Skrull race, are they intentionally created with a message? And there are some who argue no. According to this paper, published in 2015, The Mutant Problem, X-Men, Confirmation Bias, and the Methodology of Comics and Identity by Martin Lund. This is published in the European Journal of American Studies. Now, Lund goes on to talk about that, and this is from the abstract. This article suggests that scholarship on comics and identity is vulnerable to strong confirmation bias. Engaging with a few common assumptions presented in writing on X-Men comics from 1963 to 1970 and 1975 to 1991, and identity. It offers alternative interpretations on the series' engagement with the Cold War, civil rights, individual authenticity, persecution, and the Holocaust. Based on these discussions, the article then offers a few methodological suggestions that might help reduce bias in future studies of comics and identity. So there are some who believe that, people have gotten into the X-Men and they begin to say, oh, Morph is a non-binary character, therefore the writers of this character must have been wanting to connect to a sense of identity or authenticity or, a reference to a person's ability to change or morph throughout their life. in terms of reading that, confirmation bias is a strong way to say it. I think it's just representation seeking. I think that people are looking for representation of themselves, and comic books do present a way for people to say, yeah, I connect with that character. I mean, who doesn't have at least one superhero that they kind of can get where they're coming from? For example, a someone who reads comic books and their parents were killed at a young age and they were raised by somebody who was a surrogate family. I mean, who are we talking about there? I mean, if we're talking about looking for, representation in a comic book, what heroes could someone who had, who experienced the loss of their parents in childhood, raised by a surrogate family, what heroes can we connect with on that? I mean, legitimately, you've got Peter Parker, you have Clark Kent, you have Bruce Wayne, you have a number of these characters who have experienced that, and these characters create an archetype, and those archetypes are repeated throughout many of the character developments that come later down. You got Peter Quill, you've got Dwayne Taylor, who is Night Thrasher, you have multiple different openings that somebody can read a character and say, well, I see me in this character, therefore I identify with this character, I'm going to read and be connected with this character. That's not confirmation bias, that's identity seeking, that's representation seeking, to find something to connect with. But going beyond that, many people have looked at comic books as allegory. The ability to tell a story about what is happening in the real world in a way that people can get into it through entertainment but still hear the message. And this is where confirmation bias comes in. This is where confirmation bias comes in that the belief is that the comic books aren't doing that intentionally, that people are looking at the circumstances and therefore they are reading into what is happening in the story. The story is a story in and of itself, and therefore you are looking for justification for your worldview in these events, and you're using that to provide, a narrative to be able to connect your worldview with something that is not necessarily about that. Confirmation bias can be present in the reading of comic books, but we also need to look at the possibility that comic books not only can be misread, but they can also be written intentionally in that way. According to this paper, Mutants, Metaphor, and Marginalism, what exactly do the X-Men stand for, by P. Andrew Miller? The first X-Men title appeared in 1963 when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were first building the Marvel lineup. Running out of interesting origin stories, Lee decided to create a team of superheroes who were born with super abilities instead of being written by radioactive arachnids or bombarded by cosmic rays. Taking the scientific principle of genetic mutation, Lee stretched the premise to its limit and created the original X-Men. Now, when we look at those stories of the X-Men, and you look at what the early stories and the ongoing stories looked like, one of the very first things you run into is the conflict between Charles Xavier and Magneto. And their worldviews collide in that you have Magneto saying, we need to fight for mutant kind because Homo sapiens deserve to be ruled by Homo superior. And you have Xavier saying, no, what we need to do is we need to create an attitude of cooperation. Hold our identity, but show Homo sapien how Homo superior can be integrated. And so you have this conflict between Xavier and Magneto. And that conflict, sets up a lot of the surrounding attitudes of mutant kind. Because mutant kind, in terms of what Magneto wants to accomplish becomes something to be feared. And Xavier convinces his students, the X-Men, to hide some of who they are so they don't appear to be as frightening. So they don't inspire as much fear. Even the character of Nightcrawler, who is the clearest example of this, the character of Nightcrawler is drawn as a dark blue black, furry, diminutive, demonic elf-like character. Has a tail that wraps around and ends in an arrow chevron. Nightcrawler is immediately, visibly not Homo sapien. And Nightcrawler struggles with his inability to go out in public. He hides in shadows. He hides his identity, using an overcoat and a fedora to cover up his ears. He hides that because he knows that people automatically react to him in a negative way. But eventually, Xavier actually, commissions a device that Nightcrawler can wear that masks his appearance. He activates the device and he takes on a human appearance. And Xavier is always trying to tell the X-Men, don't reveal yourself openly. Such that when their identities are revealed as mutants, there is a backlash against them. There's a backlash such that we see, committees formed in government. We see industries that develop around containing the mutant threat. Mutants are presented as subhuman, not human, and deserve to be controlled. And so you have the Mutant Registration Act, where if you are a mutant, you must be identified and put on a list. You have the creation of the Sentinels, which are a group of mechanical androids that can scan for mutant genetics and can use their built-in powers to subdue and take into custody any mutants who are not registered. And there's a very famous storyline involving a futurescape where mutants have been all but eradicated, and it takes some timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly stuff to divert that timeline. But you also have a reaction by humans. And I use humans versus mutants because that's the designation, that's the separation that is created within the comic book. You have human versus mutant, Homo sapien versus Homo superior. And the the reaction of humans gets to we see, gets to the point that we see mobs developing. We see crowds gathering around mutants that are identified and becoming hostile and aggressive and violent. And we see that, we see that in the 70s. We see this in the 60s and the 70s. And that's when the X-Men became sort of attached to the allegory for racial tension in the United States. That allegory has existed throughout the entire history of the X-Men comic books. According to CBR, Jonathan Thompson identifies 10 comic book narratives that mirrored real-world issues in the X-Men. So, you have parallels can be seen between Giant-Size X-Men #1 and the Vietnam War. In Len Wein's Giant-Size X-Men, there was an allegory for the Vietnam War. Though the war was formally concluded in 1973, American involvement in Vietnam continued until days before the publication. In the story, original X-Men were trapped on Krakoa, a sentient Pacific Ocean island, and was feeding off of them. In the Vietnam War, it took place in a tropical country in the Pacific and was sustained by thousands of lives provided by the government in addition to Vietnamese losses. So we see the allegory between the X-Men and the Vietnam War. The legacy virus provided commentary on HIV/AIDS. The legacy virus was a virus that swept through the mutant population. And, it was quickly associated with the idea the virus attacking the X gene made mutants analogs to gay men who were disproportionately affected by HIV/AIDS. The mutant cure put a spotlight on conversion therapy. At multiple points in the history of the X-Men, there has been a cure proposed for the mutant condition. The idea that if you go through a process, you can come out on the other side to live a normal life. In Gifted, Dr. Kavita Rao created a mutant cure which eliminated mutation by suppressing the X gene. The cure is analogous to the conversion therapy effort, a pseudoscientific practice used in attempts to cure members of the LGBT community. The island nation of Genosha reflected South African apartheid, wherein mutant kind on the island nation of Genosha were enslaved and the X-Men go into Genosha to discover that the mutant population is sustaining the wealth and stability that is being built in the island nation. Mutants of Genosha were considered property of the state. They underwent a process by the local government that removed their free will. And eventually we see the X-Men go in and disrupt Genosha as a, liberation by the X-Men. The X-Men in X-Men Red addressed the issue of fake news. Anti-mutant groups with torches gathered, pro-mutant groups clashed with these hate groups, hate crimes and murders rose. Nova incited violent division through the legitimizing of dehumanization and speciesism. Cassandra Nova began using Sentinels to program mutant hatred in the minds of others. Soon, websites, news channel personalities, and blogs spewing disinformation about mutants began reaching a fever pitch. Reverend William Stryker shows the ways people can use their own agendas to hurt others. In the 1982 graphic novel God Loves, Man Kills, Claremont's narrative, which was heavily adapted in X2, X-Men United, sees the X-Men face Reverend William Stryker, a popular religious figure with an anti-mutant agenda. Through the lens of his beliefs, Stryker wholeheartedly believed that it was his duty to secure the extinction of the mutant race. Uncanny X-Men touched on the coming out experience. Iceman's coming out in 2015 is one more example of Marvel moving away from mutant metamorphosis as metamorphs for the LGBT community to actually having LGBT characters. Cassandra Nova was a vehicle for exploring terrorism. And then we have two big allegories that have been through the X-Men for quite some time. The Dark Phoenix saga tackled addiction. The saga is full of symbolism. One aspect that is widely visible is its take on addiction. After finding her powers greatly enhanced by the Phoenix Force, which bonded with her to save her life, Jean Grey was riding a cosmic high. This was Claremont's intent with introducing the Phoenix to make Jean more interesting, useful, and powerful. However, Jean's journey culminated in a downward spiral that parallels the dark side of addiction. And then, in X-Men number 1, the X-Men took on the Cold War. In X-Men number 1, you have the X-Men directly going after Magneto, who is coded in communist association. Through his language, through his costume, and he attacks the U.S. military in something very akin to the blockade during the Bay of Pigs. So you've seen allegories built into the X-Men from the very first issue. So, Tiger Brat mentioned that the artists, the writers, have talked about these things all along. Well, let's see what they do have to say for themselves. This is from Cinema Blend. The article, How the Civil Rights Movement Inspired X-Men Comics. For over 50 years, the X-Men comics and movies have connected fans over its overt commentary about the division of two people, the mutants and everyone else. As Chris Claremont said back in 1982, the X-Men are hated, feared, and despised collectively by humanity for no other reason that they are mutants. So what we have here, intended or not, is a book that is about racism, bigotry, and prejudice. 1982 was looking at, right there at 1982, we were watching the civil rights movement kind of bear some fruit. In the 1970s, we saw more representation of the black community in positive ways. We saw more representation of black men and women in employment. We saw these things as more of an integration, not complete integration by any stretch of the imagination. There was still racism. There was still bigotry. There was still prejudice. But at 1982, we are looking at a little more integration than what we saw in the 1950s and the 1960s. Claremont said, we can't avoid this. Whether we wrote it or not that way, we cannot avoid this. We can't avoid discussing it. From Sci-Fi, X-Men as a Queer Metaphor by Sarah Century. The early years of the X-Men were fairly low on significant social commentary beyond the basic elements of its premise. Indeed, the initial comparison between Xavier and Magneto and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. give an extremely lopsided view of the beliefs of both activists. Magneto, even painted as an extremist and mutant supremacist, and comparing that to Malcolm X is obviously problematic, as Malcolm X wasn't doing things like attempting to knock the Earth off its axis with the power of magnetism. Now, allegory does not require literal, okay? So, let's kind of take a step back from that. It is true that comparisons between the civil rights movement in the 60s and the very fictional X-Men of the 60s don't fare particularly well, but that isn't where the metaphor ended. Implications and references to homosexuality began to appear more prominently after the early 80s. In God Loves, Man Kills, we were talking about William Stryker. Stryker uses a campaign much like the Lavender Scare to declare that mutants are always hiding among the decent, ordinary people of the world, posing an invisible threat. Actual mention of queer characters was non-existent through this time, and there was a great deal of suppression on queer subject matter at Marvel. Well into the 80s, more and more queer subtext was played out in the pages, like Ilyana Rasputin and Kitty Pryde wrestling with each other in bed, Storm and Yukio's fling, Mystique and Destiny appearing only in tangent to one another, North Star's lack of interest in women, Rachel Summers in her entirety. There was a lot more implied queerness in Claremont's X-Men run. So, we begin to see these codings within the writing that do connect with queer identity, including getting into the legacy virus in the 90s. But Claremont, who is probably the most popular creator behind the X-Men comics, Claremont was responsible for some of the most memorable storylines and and oversaw the creation of some of the most iconic characters within X-Men history. But if we want to really truly go to the source, if we really want to truly go back and look, were the X-Men something more than just about the division? We've got to talk about Stan the Man Lee. From history, Dante A. Champaglia. I don't know. I'm apologizing right up front. Did Stan Lee support the civil rights movement through his comic books for Marvel? In 2017, Marvel published a video featuring Stan Lee where he says, those stories have room for everyone, regardless of their race, gender, religion, or color of their skin. In 2000, he told The Guardian that he loved the idea that the separation between Xavier and Magneto was not clear in black and white. Rather than a black and white battle between good and evil, the X-Men had a wrinkle. Mutants were hated by the normal humans they defended, meaning that they were written so that they did good like the Fantastic Four, they did good like the Avengers, they did good like Spider-Man, but humanity hated them because they were so different. In the article, Stan says, I loved that idea. It not only made them different, but it was a good metaphor for what was happening with the civil rights movement in the country at that time. Now, Stan Lee is well known for sort of adapting the narrative down the road. And so sometimes you have to take Stan's words later in life with a little bit more skepticism. You have to approach Stan Lee and look at what he said over the body of his career and not just where he is at a point in his career. So he says in 2000 that, it was a good metaphor for what was happening with the civil rights movement in the country at that time. Now, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were both Jewish in heritage. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby gave birth to Marvel Comics, creating the stories, the characters, the art, and the words that we see in the very beginning of the Fantastic Four, where we have a Jewish character in Ben Grimm. They were there with Peter Parker. They were there with the Avengers, the Incredible Hulk, and Jack Kirby and Stan Lee bringing their history as men from Jewish lineage. In the 1960s, both Lee and Kirby were alive during World War II. So you had them bringing a unique perspective on the idea of what it meant when mutants were hated by normal humans. But like I said, we have to look at the body of Stan Lee's work. We have to go back and we have to actually look at Stan's statements in the time frame. In 1966, Lee and his X-Men collaborator, King Kirby, again engaged with racial equality when they created Black Panther, a black superhero who was also the king of the fictional African nation Wakanda, an Afrofuturist wonderland of high-tech exceptionalism. And 2 years later, in a Stan soapbox column, Lee made his most explicit statement yet on civil rights and acceptance. So this is in 1966, 1967. And here is a copy of some of the statements that Stan Lee made in that time frame. This month we're going to yak about something that has nothing to do with our mags. Over the years, we've received a zillion letters asking for the bullpen's opinion about such diverse subjects as Vietnam, civil rights, the war on poverty, and the upcoming election. We're phantasmagorically flattered that our opinion would matter to you. But here's the hang-up. There isn't any unanimous bullpen opinion about anything, except possibly mother love and apple pie. Take the election, for example. Some of us are staunch Democrats and others dyed-in-the-wool Republicans. As for yours truly and a few others, we prefer to judge the person rather than the party line. That's why we seek to avoid editorializing about controversial issues, not because we haven't our opinions, but rather because we share the same diversity of opinion as Americans everywhere. But we'd like to go on record about one vital issue. We believe that man has a divine destiny and an awesome responsibility. The responsibility of treating all who share this wondrous world of ours with tolerance and respect. Judging each fellow human on his own merit, regardless of race, creed, or color. That we agree on, and we'll never rest until it becomes a fact rather than just a cherished dream. In the next issue of Stan's Soapbox, remember last issue when we told you we'd shy away from editorializing? Well, no sooner did we go to press than a flood of new letters arrived concerning the great soapbox conspiracy, and the vast majority went like this. Dear Stan, in your recent soapbox column, you asked if Marveldom assembled wanted you to editorialize more. I vote yes. What has separated Marvel from other mags is that you have a definite, profound philosophy to express, and the way you express it is beautiful. Marvelism is fast becoming a philosophical movement. A prime example of this can be found in the Silver Surfer, one of the most moralistic characters ever created. Marvel Comics are the voice of a new breed of intellectual. Therefore, editorializing is virtually a necessity. Oops. So that sinks it. From now on, whenever we have something to get off our collective chest, we'll assume we have a magniloquent mandate to sock it to you and let the chips fall where they may. And then notice the line. Next-ish, what is a bigot? And so the next issue of Stan's soapbox, let's lay it right on the line. Bigotry and racism are among the deadliest social ills plaguing the world today, but unlike a team of costume supervillains, they can't be halted with a punch in the snoot or a zap from a ray gun. The only way to destroy them is to expose them, to reveal them for the insidious evils they really are. The bigot is an unreasoning hater, one who hates blindly, fanatically, indiscriminately. If his hang-up is black men, he hates all black men. If a redhead once offended him, he hates all redheads. If some foreigner beat him to a job, he's down on all foreigners. He hates people he's never seen, people he's never known, with equal intensity, with equal venom. Now, we're not trying to say it's unreasonable for one human being to bug another, but although anyone has the right to dislike another individual, it's totally irrational, patently insane, to condemn an entire race, to despise an entire nation, to vilify an entire religion. Sooner or later, we must learn to judge each other on our own merits. Sooner or later, if man is ever to be worthy of his destiny, we must fill our hearts with tolerance, for then and only then will we be truly worthy of the concept that man was created in the image of God, a God who calls us all his children. Pax et justitia. Stan. Does anybody know Latin? Peace and justice. Pax et justitia. Peace and justice. Peace and equality. Peace and righteousness. Stan Lee in 1966, 1967 came out and said very plainly that racism, religious ideology, any bigotry based on a concept that somebody is less worthy, that bigotry gets in our way of success as a people. And you all ask the question, what is Marvelism? Marvelism is the fandom that rose around Marvel Comics. From the very beginning, there has been a separation of Marvel fans and DC fans. Those who identify with Marvel more, yours truly, would be part of the ism of Marveldom, which would be the fandom of Marvel. So Marvelism is just the idea of being connected to the worldview and the morals and the ethics that are laid out, the philosophical worldview of Marvel. That's Marvel. Ism. But Stan Lee in 1966, 1967 came right out and said, look, we don't want to talk about these things directly. But these things are very real. We don't want to talk about these things, and insert our opinion because we recognize that everybody has opinions, and sometimes our opinions are differing. But when push came to shove and Stan Lee was kind of put in a place of saying, what do you believe? Stan says, okay. I love this line. So that sinks it. From now on, whenever we have something to get off our collective chest, we'll assume we have a magniloquent mandate to sock it to you and let the chips fall where they may. And his very next writing is the definition of bigotry, which is that which stands in the way of all people coming together. So whether or not you believe it is confirmation bias, or it is metaphor and allegory, or it is representation seeking, we cannot separate that books like the X-Men, characters like Black Panther and the Falcon and Luke Cage, eventually characters like North Star and Iceman, individuals like Morph, Mystique, Cloud. We cannot separate their existence within the Marvel universe from the impact that they were written in a time when people could see the bigotry that they themselves were experiencing in the real world. So whether it was a direct commentary or it was simply people living their lives and finding something to hope in those books, the result is the same. The X-Men have always been woke. The X-Men have always been openly and categorically about raising others to a level of humanity that some humans want to prevent. Friends, we are not just talking about a comic book here. We're talking about using the media to provide narratives, and whether those narratives are the intention of the author and the artist, or they are the interpretation of the reader and the consumer. That narrative has a life that needs to be considered. Because sometimes the narrative is outdated. And sometimes the narrative becomes more relevant. But as for the X-Men, since 1964, the narrative has been they are feared because they are different. And since their very first issue, we have only continued to see bigotry, division, persecution, and genocide when people who are different occupy the same space. So whether you are a follower of Xavier or you are a follower of Magneto, or maybe you are somewhere in between, we read the X-Men to see people like us and to find a reason to hope and keep fighting each and every day. All right, that's it for the deep dive for today. Yeah, I mean, I've always read Marvel. I mean, I always preferred Marvel, but hell, I'll just show you. No, not that one. Well, wag your tail when I call you baby. It's fine with me. These two books right here, okay? Um, these two books are um, these are two of my earliest dives into DC Comics. Now, these are both from 1981, the summer of 1981. And I remember buying these when I was a kid. And I loved these books. And somewhere along all of my journeys and travels, I lost my original copies that I had. So I went on an expedition to hunt down and capture and bring these two back into my life, and I did. But these two books are DC. Secret Origin of DC Superheroes and DC Comics Presents Superman. And each one of these little bitty books, I mean, they're not very big at all, right? They're small. Each of these is 100 pages of stories. And let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stories, 9, 10 stories in this one, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 multi-part stories in this one. And so, I mean, these books were, for me, part of my childhood. They were an important part of my growth as a comic book reader and a comic book collector. They are DC, but I am a diehard Marvel. I'm a diehard Marvel fan. You all have seen that about me. My favorite hero is, I got to show it off. Nova. All right, that's my favorite superhero. Richard Rider, Nova. Taskmaster is my favorite villain. I love Moon Knight. I'm a Marvel through and through. And one of the reasons why I'm a Marvel is because of that social allegory, that social message that comes through. I identified with Peter Parker very early on. I was a brainiac outsider and didn't, have a lot of friends and was relatively, interested in science and being a nerd. That was me. So Peter Parker was my kind of character. But I've grown over time, and some of those characters I've outgrown, and I've taken on other characters as favorites over my life. But I've never considered Marvel as just a funny book like they used to be called. Because there's always been, a hint of social awareness in those books. And even before I was about social awareness, those books were commentaries. And I think it's important. It's important to recognize that heritage as a part of the cultural milieu that we have seen over the last 60 years. So, And going back even further, I mean, hell, you have Superman, Batman, taking on crime and things like that, and gangs and as such. You have Captain America punching Adolf Hitler during World War II. So, there have been those comments. Yes, legacy. Yes, legacy, my dear. What shall it be? I will admit that when I was younger, I would very much be identified with Xavier. Um, Charles Xavier was more of a representation of my worldview in that, cooperation and reconciliation and the bringing together of opposing sides was very important to me. Um, right now, I definitely I definitely identify more with Magneto than I ever have in my life. Um, but I would probably identify more um, with more militant groups of mutants. X Factor, for instance. Um, X Factor. So, if you don't know the history, X Men started out with um, Cyclops, Marvel Girl, Jean Grey, Beast, Angel, and Iceman. Um, when the um, when Claremont came on board and he introduced a new set of X Men, he introduced Nightcrawler, Wolverine, Colossus, Storm, and Thunder, Thunderchild, Thunderstar, Thunder. Names escaping me at the moment. James Proudstar's character, but he introduced these new characters, and the original characters left. They left. So eventually, I mean, there was some floating, in and out and back and forth. But eventually, the original characters, Cyclops, Jean, Beast, Angel, Iceman, they created a new group called X Factor. And X Factor's job was more subversive because what X Factor would do was they wore costumes that would mask their identity, and they gave the appearance that they had that they didn't have mutant powers, but instead that their powers were somehow technologically involved. And the X Factor team would go out in reports where a mutant was somehow displaying powers, and X Factor would go out and take them into custody. Well, what they were doing is actually they were going out and finding them before other anti-mutant movements could react to them. They would get them and then put them into safe houses or get them to Xavier's school, or they would try to get them into a safer place. So it was kind of like a mutant underground. I'm definitely looking, at associating with them, more and more, because it's an idea of we've got to do the things to subversive actively protect ourselves. So yeah, that's kind of who I connect with. Yeah, the dryer is going here. I have a really good mic. The box is open. If you wanna chat about the X-Men, that's what the conversation is. We're talking about the X-Men and conservatives losing their collective shit over finding out that the X-Men are woke, and always have been. Damn it! Here, let's get my hair on straight. So, tell you what, if you want to come in, hang on, Kari. Let me go get some coffee. I'll be right back, and we'll hop up. All right. All right, Kari.
Hello.
Greetings.
And hallucinations.
Yeah, I'm keeping mine under control.
That was an old thing that I would sometimes say, greetings and hallucinations. I don't know where I picked it up from, but yeah.
Cool.
So when you said greetings, it immediately reminded me of and hallucinations.
Yeah. I typically say greetings and salivations.
Yeah, there you go too. It depends on how good that candy bar is for your salivations.
Meal replacement protein bar.
Gotcha. But is it at least, decent tasting?
Decent, yes.
Is it I've got to force myself to eat it because I know I need it?
Yep, that's it exactly.
Uh,
It's
yeah,
got
I
a
mean, if the,
it's got a chocolate-like flavor and a peanut butter-like flavor.
chocolate and peanut butter like flavor.
Yep.
That's disturbing. Like,
Well, it is.
nah,
I mean,
I'm going stir crazy in here.
you're a
I am
one.
so wanting to crawl through the window, see if I can get one of my friends to drive my Jeep up. Crawl through the window and.
I know, hon.
What the thing is, this was happened just a few days before bottom surgery consultation in Gainesville. I don't know if I had said that yet or not, but yeah, it was the week before I was to go to Gainesville for consultation.
Mm.
Now I don't know if this is going to prevent me from being able to have surgery.
In the short term,
It
yes.
probably will. Huh?
In the short term, yes.
Well, I mean, am I no longer a good candidate because of heart conditions?
I mean, that remains to be seen,
Yeah. I'm going to have to get back in contact with the doctor in Gainesville and see. I'll be honest, I had totally forgotten about it. I totally didn't even realize that I had it. The memory was scrambled.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking that I was living in my old apartment at one point instead of my house.
Right.
There are still some things that don't add up.
Mm-hmm.
Picture of my cat from not too long ago, which I'm told my cat had passed months ago.
Right.
So where did this picture of the cat come from? And video.
Yeah.
Now my other cat, yeah. But anyway, because I had two cats.
Right.
Rusty and Faye.
It's going to be tough because Luna, yes, Crystal is a very safe person. Crystal is somebody that I know in real life and is very important to me. So, but you've got to, Kari, there's some of that that may be gone.
Yeah.
And learning to be patient and learning to deal with those things. It's tough. It's really tough because,
oh yeah,
the frustration of it.
The thing is, this happened 1 week before I was to go to Gainesville for bottom surgery consultation.
Yeah.
That's what is so annoying about it. And I didn't remember that at all.
Right.
And I got a phone call from the doctor, talking about the consultation, and that's what reminded me of it.
Right.
Yeah, not fun. Anyway, I don't know what that wasn't the original reason why I was coming up, and I totally forgot. You went to go do something, and there was something that I was going to say, something I was going to reference. No, but I've always preferred Marvel over DC.
Right. I mean, I was never a huge X-Men fan. Okay, I was never really deep into it, but I was very familiar with the characters and
Mm-hmm.
the circumstances because they bled over into so many other comics. And
Oh yeah.
while in the 70s and the 80s there wasn't as much of the hostility that we see in the 90s and the 2000s, um, and now, um, there was still that mistrust, that sense of there's something different about this group. And you go back and you look at the history of the Avengers. Hank McCoy was at one time an Avenger. Um,
Mm-hmm.
well, that's cool, Crystal. Um, but in terms of integration of mutants um, into the big names. I mean, you don't have, even when they did replacements um, in the Fantastic Four, the only time that they have had a mutant was a very short term replacement. Both Wolverine and Storm have been associated with the Fantastic Four at one point or another. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't see them integrated on an ongoing basis. Um, Now, the belief that Franklin and Valeria are mutants is very prominent because their power, their abilities have manifested very early on. But Valeria's power, so to speak, isn't as much um, a power as it is a super intelligence. Um,
Mm-hmm.
as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, she was on par with Reed, and so intelligent that she could outthink um, most adults in any situation.
There
So,
was always the well, sorry, I didn't mean to
no,
cut you
go ahead.
off.
Go ahead.
There was always the difference between mutation and mutant. Spider-Man, for example, was a mutation, whereas of course, the X-Men were mutants. There's always that contradiction. There's always that that was, at least for a little while, like in the '70s, that was kind of an important theme and differentiation in Marvel, was the difference between the mutant and the mutation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have Bruce Banner. I mean, that mutation into the Hulk is,
Hmm.
foundational within Marvel Comics.
Yeah.
You have Captain America, whose body has been mutated through exposure to the super soldier serum.
Right.
Um,
Specifically, I was thinking of Fantastic Four, for example.
right. You have them because their exposure to cosmic radiation was the transforming feature.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there has been plenty of efforts to at times retcon some of those stories.
Yeah.
Spider-Man being the most infamous of it, and saying, He was a teenager when he was bitten by the spider, but was the spider responsible for his powers, or were his powers activated by the spider? Were the
Yeah,
powers
the Spider
present
Man.
prior to, or, did they come as a result of? So there was that debate that was going on for a long time.
Yeah, basically a catalyst effect.
Right. So, Spider Man they've played very loose with in terms of, which is true of him, chicken and egg case, or spider and egg case, I guess this might be. Um, Especially when you get into the entirety of um, when they have dipped over into his metamorphosis periods. Um, yeah.
I was just going to say one thing that if you remember the early 80s or maybe late 70s Spider-Man cartoon, not the not the one where he teams up with the um, um, Spider-Man and his Amazing Friends, but the one immediately before Spider-Man and his Amazing Friends.
Mm-hmm.
In it, it shows in the opening credits the spider biting him, and the shows like the inside of his body, the venom hitting his cells and causing them mutate
Right.
in the opening credits. I don't know what something you had said in there reminded me of that. It was a
Yeah.
very short-lived cartoon. Um, I think it was quickly canceled in order to basically go into the Amazing Friends.
Right. Which, interestingly enough, you have Spider Man and his amazing friends, two mutants.
Hmm.
Both Firestar and Iceman are mutants. Now, I don't know if they were chosen just because of the dichotomy of hot and cold, but you have these two characters who are now Firestar was created for the show because they wanted to do Human Torch, but they
Yeah.
couldn't get access to the rights to the torch. So they created uh,
Yeah.
Angelica and brought in, Iceman, who, I mean, was there at the foundation of the X-Men. So they just made the association between the two. Um,
Yeah.
you
And I
know, the
think they did that on purpose for the hot and cold. You know, the give and take between that. Uh, the opposites of that.
Yeah, but I mean, this the weirdness of it all. You have Spider-Man who is associated with two mutants, um, and at that point, there was no direct connection between Spider-Man and any mutant storylines in a profound and deep way. Spider-Man was not a
Uh,
friend of Iceman. Spider-Man was a friend of Johnny, and that's the deepest friendship that you see Spider-Man having in the entire Marvel universe. So it's funny that they created this new storyline and wedged Spider-Man into a relationship that had existed nowhere within the comics before.
uh, and when I was a kid, people kept wanting to see a romantic relationship between Firestar and Spider-Man.
Yeah,
That was one of the big things that people that other kids that I knew kept wanting to see happen.
right. Firestar has a great.
Sounds like a timber just occurred.
Sorry, Chris was putting things away.
No worries. I
Um,
just hope no one got hurt.
Firestar has a great comic book story, and I absolutely love the comic version of Firestar. Angelica is has been through the ringer in terms of the highs and the lows of her career. First, um, she was introduced through the Hellfire Club, and um, Emma Frost deceives her into believing that she's she's doing something right, but Emma Frost is using the Hellfire Club, the Marauders, not the Marauders, I can't remember the name of the group right off the top of my head, but using them to kind of advance her own personal agendas. But then you have Firestar sort of separating from X-Men and mutant kind in general. Then she's brought back in during the 90s for the New Warriors. And
Well,
huh?
I was going to ask, wasn't she created for Spider-Man and his Amazing Friends?
Yeah, she was created for
Yeah.
that, but they
Okay.
rolled her into the
Yeah, yeah,
canon
yeah.
universe.
Yeah, yeah. I knew that they did that, but
Yeah.
I was thinking, if I was remembering correctly, I think that that was the order for her creation. Was at first for the cartoon, because that was in the late '70s,
Right.
that got started.
And, when they introduced Firestar to the New Warriors, um, they develop her character and they give her a significant amount of strength throughout the course of that story. She falls in love with someone, a teammate. They have a very powerful romantic connection. Another mutant who is on the New Warriors, Vance Astro, Marvel Boy, and eventually Justice is his code name. But then after the New Warriors ends, her time with the New Warriors ends, her story takes on a very dark and tragic side because her powers give her cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And because of her powers, she has to face cancer. And, there's this story of how her friends, the ones who come to her and support her and lift her up, they go about trying to help her. And it's wild how they manage to do that. But Firestar has been an amazing character, even though she was created as a stand-in for the Human Torch.
Yeah, and I think she was created specifically for Spider-Man and his Amazing Friends.
Now she
I'll
is.
be honest.
Hmm?
When I was a kid, during when that television series was created, I kind of wanted to be Firestar.
That's fair. That's fair. I mean, I think there are times when all of us on this side of the gender,
Yeah,
spectrum.
but it was. I mean, jeez, I was like, what? I had to have been around because was this going back? Did Spider-Man and his Amazing Friends actually go back into the? I think it was only like '82.
Hang on.
I think it was '82.
Let's see. Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, television series, 1981.
Okay, I was 1 year off, so I was 11.
Yeah.
No, I'm at 12. I was about 12 because I was born in '69.
So
I
it
was
last
12.
production was 1981 to 1983. So
Something that you said in the deep dive, and it is somewhat off topic to what you two are currently discussing, but I don't have much to add to what the current discussion is. Because I'm just a baby.
you're a nerdling.
Yeah. It's just you were talking about confirmation bias, where one of the papers that you referenced was talking about the fact that people want to believe that the X-Men is about this, therefore they read into it.
Right.
And you've done a brilliant job at showing that these references and allegories have always been there, and that they are purposeful.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, even if they were not purposeful, we cannot just say because the author did not intend it this way, we cannot read it that way.
Right, and that's what I was saying in the conclusion. You know, it's not just about what the author intended. That, you know, the narrative becomes, and this goes back to our entire back and forth about the death of the author and all of that shit. But you know, when I read something, my my takeaways from that are going to be filtered by the experiences that I brought into it.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, just like Kari saying, you know, that she identified with Firestar. You know, that's that, you know, that connection there, that longing to be a part of that character's existence and not Iceman, not Spider-Man. We bring that in and begin to live vicariously. That's the power of books, is it not? I mean, the reason why books are so wonderful is that we get to live vicariously some life that is different from our narrative, but yet we bring all of the filters of our narrative into it.
Go ahead.
So that's what I mentioned earlier in the live, that one of the amazing things about fiction is that you can see yourself in a character.
Yeah.
That you can read yourself into a character. And I remember very vividly when Black Panther hit cinemas. A lot of white people would start off by saying, I know I can't relate, but... And then they would say the things about the character that they did relate to.
Yeah.
As if they can relate to the Norse god alien thing, or the cybernetic human crafted from bits and bobs and things in a gemstone, more than they can relate to a black person. People always wanted to qualify, I can't relate, but, and then they would list the things that they relate to. Just because a character like Morph is now canonically non-binary does not mean that a cisgender person cannot relate to that character. You can still relate to the experiences of that character. It just means that we have overt representation of our experiences as transgender people, as non-binary people.
Well, and you see, the thing is, I did this with other characters too. Laura Ingalls on Little House on the Prairie. I strongly related to her. I mean, there were a number of different female characters. Oh, what was it called? Escape to Witch Mountain, Tia. Again, I imagined that if I was a girl, I would look like the girl who played Tia.
I always wanted to be the Blue Ranger. I never wanted to be the Yellow or Pink Ranger, for example. And that translated into the Green Ranger and the Blue Ranger, but never the actual female characters.
Right.
And even when I was younger, people would keep saying, well, you get along so well with boys. And I'm like, yeah, apparently that's part of my neurodivergence, but also just part of my gender identity. I do not relate as much to a cisgender woman's experience.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, I when I was playing D&D, I created a psionicist, but I created a female psionicist. And my friends were like, "You can't be a female. You can't be a
And
girl. You're a boy." And they would harass me because I had a female psionicist. And this was in the 70s,
Right.
in D&D when the psionicist issue 78 of Dragon magazine first came out. I created the female psionicist. I
and
named
this
her
is
Tanae. Go ahead, sorry.
no, don't worry. The delay in our connections sometimes is gonna mean that I'm gonna speak and then realize that you were still speaking. It
No
happens.
worries. I, I,
Um,
I, yeah, I was just, my character's name was Tanae, in my psionicist.
so I sat into a D&D game that Genie's running last night. Two of the cisgender men in the group have decided to play female characters.
Hmm.
And we were discussing this. One of them was interacting with the other, and as they're role playing, he keeps messing up the pronouns. He's like he, I mean she, the whole time, but he
Hmm.
does not get better at it. He just keeps fumbling. And this morning, when Jeannie and I were talking, we were saying that it sort of gives them the opportunity to experience a little bit of what we go through.
Yeah.
And um, that was that kind of brings us back around to the topic. Whether we you're right, Crystal. The male figures
Yeah.
were typically more fully fledged. They did have a deeper sense of character development over a history of time. There were very few female characters that received that same intentional depth, although there were some standouts over time. And it got better as we moved into more progressive age of writing. Wonder Woman was a very two dimensional character. Um,
Yeah.
Even
Quite.
at between Diana Prince and Wonder Woman, she was a very two dimensional character with a really serious undercurrent of subversive kink. Um, Even though she was coded as a kink character, they couldn't make that explicit. Um,
Yeah.
so she was a very two-dimensional character. You get up to the Fantastic Four. Sue Richards was, well, the philosophy behind Sue Richards and why there's actually a philosophical understanding of why each one of the characters ended up with the powers that they had. And the reason why Sue Richards ended up with the power of invisibility was that she saw herself as invisible in relation to Reed and Ben and even Johnny. So, even with the birth of, the Marvel comics, just looking at the lineup, you had Sue, and you had Sue Storm, and you had Janet Van Dyne, and you had Jean Grey. You had three female characters in the birth of Marvel Comics. Sue was portrayed as a typical white Midwestern submissive wife type, even when she was not married to Reed.
Yeah.
She was a fawning young girl who fell in love with this slightly older man.
Yeah.
So you have that. You have Janet Van Dyne, the Wasp, who is all about fashion and appearance and is not in any way, shape, or form taken seriously by anyone in the group, including her husband, Henry Pym, who treats her as if she is just a uh, an annoying, you know, chatterbox. And
Yeah.
then you have Jean Grey, who, of the three females introduced in Marvel Comics, Jean Grey has the most substance to her, but at the same time, she is, in a very weird way, I mean, she is the romantic interest of Scott, but also Charles Xavier has a thing for her.
And later on, Wolverine as well.
Yeah, and later on Wolverine, that's in the 70s. But that's, I mean, that's where Marvel started. And it's not until we get
Yeah.
into the 70s that we do see a little more character development. We get a character such as Storm, who, first of all, is African born, poverty raised, um, you know, is given, you know, an opportunity to become more than her birth and more than her caste over time. Um, you have characters over on the that's Sue Storm, the Invisible Girl, the Invisible Woman in the Fantastic Four.
Yeah.
Um, you have, you know, over in the DC universe, you have Diana Prince takes over for a while in the 70s and is very feminist, is very uh, woman empowered as a character. In fact, Wonder Woman takes a back seat to Diana Prince. And you know, you see a little bit of development over the time, and until you get to a point where you have some real powerful female representation in the comic books. But you're right, in that time frame when we were growing up, those female characters were not very deep. They were very shallow individuals.
Well, for some reason, you know, this is my impression, but when I was a kid, even, um, I remember in sixth grade because I was at 80 Harris Sixth Grade Center, and you know, so it was one school that was only for sixth grade, no other grades were there, and I remember getting into an argument with another kid that Marvel tend to have more dynamic with their characters. DC was more just storyline and not character focused. Um, and Marvel tended to reflect more of um, the more of a feminist movement, more of a what it was, to be a woman, what it, the racial, all kinds of other aspects. It Marvel seemed to have a greater touch with that than DC. DC was mostly just this is the character, this is the superpower, let them go do their superpower things. That was the argument that I had made back then. Um, I don't know. I mean,
I mean,
So,
it's a simplified argument, and it overlooks, you know, some of the deeper things that both comics company did, because it simplifies them. Uh, from just historical perspective, you had during World War II, you had a full slate of DC characters. I mean, Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman were all introduced in the 30s. The Flash, you know, these were all established characters. You had the All Star Squadron that were established. And all of these characters were existing during World War II. The interesting thing is that they did not interact with World War II. They
right.
didn't get directly involved with that. You get to, you know, Korea. DC doesn't get directly involved with the Korean conflict. In the 1960s, you don't see DC getting directly involved with, the current events of the time. But the very first issue of Incredible Hulk speaks directly to the creation of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The very first issue of Fantastic Four has to do with space exploration. The very first issue of Spider-Man deals with science and its experimentation on animals. The very first issue of X-Men, you have the X-Men facing Magneto over nuclear-powered submarines. You have Marvel at the very beginning intersecting with the timeline that people lived in. That you have Marvel coming right out and saying, hey, look, this is a real world equivalent. In DC, you've got Metropolis. You've got Gotham City. You've got Central City. All right? Over in Marvel, you've got New York City. The vast majority of the Marvel universe is centered in and around New York City. So Marvel becomes, sort of this alternate universe of what people are living through.
Yeah.
The first issue of Iron Man. The very first issue of Iron Man. Do you know where Tony Stark is?
In the middle of a war. I remember that it changes in
He is in a southeastern Asian country looking at the use of Stark weaponry.
Mm-hmm.
And he is taken captive by a heavily Asian stereotyped caricature. 1964, Vietnam has almost fully kicked off and engaged. And here is Tony Stark in a southeastern Asian country looking at weapons that his company provided. Tony Stark Vietnam has not even been declared at this point as a full-on action of the United States government. Troops have not been fully deployed in a combat role. They've only been deployed in a consultation role. And yet, Tony Stark is in the Marvel equivalent of Vietnam.
Yeah.
So Marvel...
And that changes.
Marvel sets out to tell a story of events that are happening around the world that people are hearing not in the comic book, but they're hearing on the news. And so, Kirby and Lee and the rest are very much writing with one ear on Walter Cronkite. To just kind of, and Edward Murrow. They have one ear on the news and then one hand drawing a fictional, fantastical story.
Yeah. I remember, I wanted to do deep dives into the origins of each Marvel character that we know from the Marvel Cinematic Universe a while ago, and I started with the Iron Man series. Where does he occur in the MCU? How did Iron Man start? What was in the comic books? What was not in the comic book? How was it adapted? Things like that. And I very much remember that with each iteration of a reintroduction of Tony Stark, that origin story would change to the most current conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Up to where in the release of the first Iron Man film, it was very much coded to be Middle Eastern.
Right. Yeah. And it's, you have the Iron Man movie released, in Hey Nikki, how beautiful. How you doing?
I want the Iron Man movie?
Yeah. 2001?
Was it not? Yeah. I had 2011 in my mind, but I think it was earlier than that.
So,
Hi, Nikki.
Yeah, maybe it was, I don't know. But you have Iron Man coming out and taking the essential story of the original origin of Iron Man, relocating it and making it very modern. my favorite comic book when I was a teenager, 2008. Thank you, Becca. My favorite comic book when I was a teenager was G.I. Joe, Real American Hero. And G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, was set in a contemporary time. Slightly more future, maybe. But you were led to believe that this was taking place in the world that we inhabit. The characters who make up the G.I. Joe team, for those who have been long-tooth combat veterans, in fact, 3 of the primary stories from the G.I. Joe universe, Snake Eyes, Stalker, and Storm Shadow, were all part of the same long-range recon patrol unit in Vietnam. And they were a part of the same unit. Eventually, you have Storm Shadow going in a path of vengeance, and you have Snake Eyes and Stalker remaining in the military and moving up through the ranks into a special forces detachment. And all of that, thanks to Larry Hama being exposed to the military as he was, he had an understanding of those things. Now, G.I. Joe has moved forward. Now, that was in 1983 when that was launched. Here we are, 40 years later. Stalker and Snake Eyes are still part of the G.I. Joe team. But as they have advanced in, the timeline, the stories have become a little more time-locked. Because they still reference being in Vietnam or another wet, sticky jungle somewhere.
Like, one of my favorite comic book films when I was younger was Watchmen. And I will say that a big part of it was because the soundtrack was done by one of my favorite bands at the time. So I'm like, we gotta go watch this. So I didn't know what to expect when we watched Watchmen. And I am very aware that a ton was changed from the actual comic books. Because in the comic books, there's a giant squid at the end that sort of kills the world. And that didn't happen in the comic book, in the movie. But it is very much centered around the Vietnamese conflict and what happened there, and what if Dr. Manhattan had existed in that time.
Right.
And had just obliterated the soldiers of Vietnam.
Right.
And what impact things like that would have had. And that's actually how I got interested in learning more about these conflicts around the world, because back then I was like 13, 14. And I'm like, I don't want to know about these things. They don't affect me.
Right. But the interesting note there is that Watchmen, Watchmen was coming out at a time when comics had taken a very dark turn.
Yes.
And the comic industry, had moved to anti-heroes. They had moved to, characters that were not afraid of using violence, not afraid of killing. Um, but you had also seen companies like DC. You had seen DC, not companies like DC, but you had seen DC moving into more realistic storylines. For example, one of the greatest storylines that it's ever been attributed to DC that was very realistic was the story of Green Arrow and Green Lantern going on a cross country tour of the United States, looking at the injustices that were happening within the country at that time. Um, Green Arrow becomes a political activist, and he runs for mayor of his city. There are all of these interesting aspects that in the late 70s and the 80s, you begin to see DC stepping into that. You have the very controversial issue of The Flash, of Green Arrow, where Speedy is, taking a hit of heroin and dealing with drug addiction. So it does become a little more realistic. It does become a little more tied to the real world and the issues of the real world. And then, of course, the great coming together of comics and real world happens with September 11th.
Yes.
Both DC and Marvel do a lot of work to bring the real world and the comic world into this moment of observance and honoring of the individuals that were impacted by September 11th. And so even though there is this generalization of DC being more fantastical, Marvel being more realistic, in reality, there's a lot more of a give and take on that.
Yeah. Like Iron Man, a large part of his story centers around addiction. Specifically alcohol addiction, but not only. And in the films, that was replaced by the cure that he needs to take to keep his arc reactor going. Yeah. But one of the things that we studied when I was at university was, why did comic book films take off as well as they did in 2001? And that's why I had 2001 in mind, because that's when the Spider-Man Raimi films came out. And for a lot of people, that was their first introduction to good comic book films. And one of the aspects that we discussed, it was 2001, 2002, is that it was this all-American hero that, like, the American flag in the first film appears at least 3 times, I think 4 times, if I recall correctly, but it was just off the back of 9/11. And it gave a lot of people something to feel good about in the wake of this mourning and grief and a countrywide feeling of hopelessness and despair. And then it also tied into being American back. And it gave people hope in their country again, a little bit. And that is part of, but not the whole of why these films started doing so well. They were well directed, they were well crafted, they were well marketed, but also the political climate in which they were released cannot be overstated.
Yeah.
Kari, are you okay?
Yeah, I'm
I
fine.
thought you were frozen.
No, I'm
For those who are joining, we are talking comic books as representation of the stories around us, launching off from the reaction of conservatives to the announcement that one of the characters in X-Men 97, a brand new animated series that picks up on the 1990s X-Men the Animated Series cartoon, one of the characters that's coming over is now outwardly identified as non-binary. And so we're talking about the idea of comic books and the intersection with the real world, talking about, how the X-Men have always been woke identified. We're talking about, some of our own experiences in reading. So, I mean, that's the conversation. You're welcome to join us and talk about these things. So, just wanted to let you all know what the subject was.
Jeannie, while I was there, you showed me a comic book with a character that had. She's basically a teenage girl with clouds floating around her. That is Cloud, right?
Yes, that is
That
Cloud.
is the. Okay. And in that comic book, there is an internal, like, back and forth in terms of gender expression, correct?
No, it's external.
External.
The character Cloud, actually morphs back and forth between male and female. And you see this character in one frame, they will be a male character. In the next frame, they are a female character. Yes, they are young in age, typically late teens, early 20s. Sadly enough, they are depicted as unclothed. The only thing that they have is a string of clouds that wrap around them in strategic ways. But the character is, the literal interpretation of gender fluid, because the character does go back and forth between male and female. And it is just a part of who they are.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the old anime series called Ranma One Half?
I am not. I'm not into anime as much.
Okay, Ranma One Half actually got started in the late '80s. Um, it's a Japanese manga series. It became really popular during the '90s. Basically, Ranma is a 16-year-old boy who is training for martial arts. Now, this is relevant because he goes to a secret ancient training ground in China where there's a bunch of cursed springs. One of the cursed springs is the spring of drowned girl. He falls into said spring, and now whenever he is splashed with cold water, he becomes a girl. Whenever he's splashed with warm water, he becomes a guy. And it is a gender. There's a lot. It's comical in focus. There's a lot of characters who, some do not know his secret, some do know his secret. A lot of the motivation is for him to protect his secret from certain other characters. Um, there's a lot of dynamic as far as there are people who are interested in him romantically, who want to be romantically involved with either the boy or the girl version of Ranma, and then want to unalive the other version of Ranma. And there's some characters know, some characters do not, and it's really um, chaotic during the show and the storyline. It was something that I started I became fascinated in Ranma back in the late '80s in the manga, and then later it became an anime series that lasted a pretty long time, like 170 something episodes. But anyway, it's a really interesting storyline in my opinion.
Yeah. And just I mean, just for clarity and historical context, Japanese literature has dealt with gender fluidity a lot more openly than European.
Hmm.
European, we're very familiar with the ideas of, the Shakespearean plays. We're very much, aware of the pantomimes. Those are the sort of the limit of European exposure to gender fluidity. Yet, whereas in Japanese culture, going back centuries, we know that there has been more openness to the fluidity of the genders, and so in a sense, that is very much a part of that is part of the history of literature, and therefore, even though they make it comedic in turn, it's also a dark comedy in turn, and it is, you know, it's going to be in Japanese culture a lot more recognized as
Yeah.
just part of the history.
As someone who enjoys anime but also um, recognizes the limitations that anime provides, um, as an example, one of my favorite anime is Assassination Classroom. And one of the characters is Nagisa, but voiced by a female character, actor, um, and very much portrayed as looking androgynous, more so towards the femme side. It is later learned that his mother always wanted a girl, so she makes him wear dresses, she makes him grow out his hair, and that's just part of the character. Um, and that's not the only character in anime that has something like that. One of my favorite things about, for example, My Hero Academia is the um, general just acceptance of transgender characters. There are
Hmm.
multiple transgender characters in My Hero Academia on both good and bad sides, and people get their pronouns correct, and people just accept them. There's nothing like, oh my god, you're a man in a dress. It's just, they're trans, so what?
Well,
Lee, would you like clarification on your question in the chat or in the live, or are you willing to wait for the video? Yes, Corey?
no, no, go ahead. You were addressing somebody in the chat.
Oh, I asked Lee what I wanted to ask.
Okay. Um, with Ranma, it's kind of interesting because there are people who accept Ranma, people who don't accept Ranma, people who actually envy Ranma, people who condemn Ranma. So there's a lot of different characters who have different reactions for different motives, and then of course there's a bunch of additional characters that have had similar type experiences but not the same as Ranma. In other words, in China there's several different pools, and each one had a different something drowned in it. So you have one person who becomes a duck when he's splashed with cold water. Ranma becomes a girl when splashed with cold water. So there's other characters who become other different entities depending on what spring that they had fallen into. So anybody who falls into the spring in Josenkyo becomes, when splashed with cold water, the entity that unalived in the spring. So it's a very interesting show, but of course, due to, I got fixated on it really strongly when it first came out, um, because of the, transgender concept and everything. So it was an interesting show.
I can imagine that it was. I haven't personally watched it. So I always enjoy not necessarily enjoy, but I take note of the number of transgender characters in anime. There is, for example, and I know some people don't consider Avatar an anime. It is an anime styled cartoon at the very
Hmm.
least. Um, has a canonically trans character in it.
Yeah.
Um, Smellerbee. And One Piece has multiple transgender characters. My Hero Academia has multiple transgender characters. In fact, there is an all women's group of cat themed heroes with a transgender woman in their ranks, and she is just accepted. She is accepted as part of the team. Nobody questions it, nobody bats an eye. But at the same time, we can also talk about the problematic parts of it, the fact that it's often played up for laughs, the fact that trans characters are often depicted as very burly men in dresses, even
Yeah.
in Japanese culture. Not culture, anime. So there are pros and cons, but
Yeah.
ultimately, I do see more representation in Japanese media than I do in Western media, and that has only recently started flipping.
Yeah. In Ranma, they do occasionally touch upon the concept. I mean, it kind of somewhat metaphorically, somewhat directly, somewhere in between. Um, but they do reference and touch upon, being transgender. Ranma has conflicts about wearing dresses and not wearing dresses, and at the very beginning, Ranma doesn't want to wear dresses, and then he puts the dress on, and then later in the series, as the series progresses, he becomes much more comfortable with being a girl. Um, at the very beginning, he doesn't want to. You see, what happens is he's cursed, where if he's splashed with cold water, he becomes a sheep. And when
Yeah.
he's splashed with warm water, he reverts back to being a male. But it creates conflict. It creates a dichotomy. It creates um, you know it creates this conflict with him. But as the series progresses, he becomes much more comfortable with it. In fact, as the series progresses, some people start saying, hey, you really do enjoy being a girl. And Ranma kind of like, yeah, yeah, I like it. So that is kind of brought out and kind of hinted at. And so, there's also this relationship where he is, his parents have agreed for their kids, meaning Ranma and this girl named Akane, to get married. So he has a fiance. And in the series, now, granted, it becomes a little too stereotypical. It becomes a little overdone, but it seems like everybody, all of the characters, seem like they're either have a claim to be the to get married to either Ranma or to Akane. Um, I mean, granted, not Akane's sisters, but just it seems like a lot of characters. It kind of gets overdone, but I really enjoyed this series.
I do want to just bring back the conversation a
Oh,
little
sorry.
bit to where we started. No, it's still on topic, but it is referring to something that was said earlier. Um, where if you look at characters that shapeshift, particularly in X-Men, They are literally fluid in their gender and in their gender expression.
Mm-hmm.
Like morph that Jeannie has been talking about. So being fluid in one's gender is not necessarily the same as being non-binary. It is a subcategory of non-binariness, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Gender fluid is someone who fluctuates,
Mm-hmm.
goes back and forth in their expression and their comfort with different pronouns and how people view them. Whereas someone who is non-binary in the way that I am not comfortable with she, her, and I am not necessarily comfortable with he, him. I don't know how I feel about it yet, but they, them, comfortable, always. I don't fluctuate.
So I think so Crystal, yes, as the series progresses, Ranma is much more acceptive of being a girl. Granted, throughout the series, there is a motivation of trying to reverse the curse from Josenkyo. Josenkyo is in China, and it's a series of springs where various different things have fell into the spring, drowned and unalived, and whoever or whatever falls into this particular spring can take on the form of whatever fell into the spring when splashed with cold water. Warm water reverts them back to their original form. But Ranma does become much more acceptive and actually shows signs of enjoying being a girl at times.
So, in the context of the series, if I understand it correctly, the character does become physically female,
Oh, yeah,
but it's not about being female, it's about the social role of being a girl.
both. Well, okay. It doesn't go into the extreme detail of being female. No, it won't get into the unique difference between a being a female and being a male. No, it doesn't go to that level. But Ranma is a female, um, and there's even one episode where, or one storyline where it's kind of hinted somewhat that Ranma has a romantic interest in a guy, but that arguably can be read into that storyline. Um, it's debatable. The series was made by Rumiko Takahashi. She's the person who also made um, I'm having a mental block on it. Um, it's one of her other really big series. But anyway, um, um, it's bugging me now that I can't think of the name. Oh, Inuyasha. Rumiko Takahashi also created Inuyasha, and um, but Ranma is hinted at having a romantic, having an interest in one of the male characters at one point, but it's never shown. It's never fully officially done.
Realized.
Yeah, it's never realized. It's just kind of vaguely hinted at. But Ranma primary romantic interest. See, also part of the reason why is that Ranma's the main story theme is that um, Akane is there's an arranged marriage with Ranma and Akane from their parents, but the two of them actually do fall in love with each other as the series progresses. But the curse um, um, stops them from fully, exploring that relationship. And the two would fall in love with each other and get married and all that had it not been for the curse. So in the storyline, that creates both a way of tying the two together, where they bond more, but then also it gets them, it pushes them apart at the same time.
So,
Okay, hold on just a second. We have taken this way off of topic. We are
I'm
going
sorry.
into gender exploration in comics, and we are not talking about the representation of, you know, marginalized people. We're not talking about the allegorical treatment of circumstances, and that's what this has been about. The deep
Hmm.
dive was about talking about how comic books portray the the events that are happening around us and try to give us a narrative to approach these events that maybe we can't settle, the conversation. We can't settle the subject of racism and bigotry. We can't settle the issues of slavery in the real world, but in the comic book world, we can see those things. And we can
Yeah.
look at them from a different lens. We can look at them from a different perspective. That's what we're talking about. So, if you
yeah.
want to have a conversation about comic books and gender, that's a different subject. We're coming back around. We're going to talk about the way that comic books deal with the real world subjects and handling the sometimes untouchables of the world that we live in using fictional characters and settings.
So that's actually where I wanted to go back to, in terms of, I don't know if it is my perception of comic books or whether this is truly a change that happened. That not at the very beginning, but somewhere around 70s, 80s, comic books were a lot less scared, quote unquote, to address different topics. So, for example, Cloud just fluctuating between the two forms was just part of the character. It wasn't necessarily something that was made a big deal of. Being able to bring in the representations of different minority groups into the X-Men, for example, the way that different wars were handled, the way that different things were happening in the United States specifically, but across the world. And then it took a turn at some point where comic books started becoming less comfortable addressing difficult topics, and it started picking up again, but now it's getting a lot of social backlash, particularly from conservative um, groups, people. Um, and I don't know if that is just my perception or whether that actually did happen.
So, I would say that over the course of comics in the last 40 years, because that's my connection to comics over 40 years. Once the bubble was burst in terms of social commentary, social editorial, comics have never backed down from it. They've never steered away from the hard topics because, I mean, for example, Civil War was, dealing with ideological differences, and the way that Civil War was written, cast that it wasn't just black and white, that it wasn't just, a matter of good and bad. There truly was an ideological spectrum that some people agreed wholeheartedly with. Some people denounced wholeheartedly. But there was also a spectrum in between, with people changing sides and people being stuck and left out of being able to make a decision. And so, you know, that very real consequence of, what happens to somebody when they take the middle road? What happens to somebody who decides, I'm going to distance myself from the argument? Well, there's still consequences for that choice. There's still consequences, from, that impact. Kari's pronouns are she, they.
Yeah.
But even though the Civil War was about registration versus freedom, I mean, we're talking about freedom of possessing our own identity. So, case in point, we had Spider-Man. Very famously, Spider-Man in Civil War is someone who encounters the consequences of his choice. And so you have Spider-Man originally aligning with Tony Stark. And Tony Stark manipulating Peter Parker and saying, Peter, if you register, I will protect you with all that I have possible. Now, Peter Parker was famous for being an isolationist when it came to his identity. He did not want to reveal his secret identity because he always had this sense of responsibility that his family would pay the penalty of his identity. Peter decides to go ahead and reveal his identity, and his greatest fear is proven true. His family is directly impacted by his coming out of the closet. And that's what it is. It is a representation of a coming out. He pulls the mask off. He reveals himself. He says, this is who I am. Peter eventually regrets his decision to out himself because of the consequences that he pays. And he decides that the only true way to recover his circumstance is quite literally a deal with the devil.
With Mephisto?
Yeah, with Mephisto. Quite literally, Peter Parker makes a deal with the devil to reclaim everything that he lost. And so, Peter Parker is now in this case, in this image of the individual who detransitions, who goes back on his ideological principle that he accepted because he can't live with the consequences of his choice.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is an example of, how these stories weave in the complexity of, our society, and how these stories weave in, these are not just fairy tales. These are not just the fictional ramblings of random characters. These are actually, narratives that take in the complexity of human experience and bring it into a very relatable narrative. Peter Parker is Spider-Man, for God's sake. He can climb walls and shoots webs and, can jump high and run fast and all of these other things. But he becomes relatable when he has to face the complexity of existing. Not as Spider-Man. Spider-Man could not fix the consequences of Peter Parker's choice.
Yeah.
Peter Parker had to choose, and then had to do what he thought he could to fix it.
Yeah. I have 2 comments relating to that, if that's okay. um, you mentioned uh, you mentioned that we could relate that story of Peter Parker effectively coming out and regretting coming out and making a decision to go back into the closet and reclaim that anonymity,
Mm-hmm.
to a detransitioner, which is something that we generally talk about here, is that often the detransitioning is as a result of social consequences.
Right.
Um, and then the second comment that I had, obviously, a lot of my first exposure to the X-Men was through the films,
Mm-hmm.
the initial films, when I was a teenager, where Bobby is a metaphor for being gay.
Mm-hmm.
And very explicitly made so, where his mom goes, "Have you tried not being a mutant?" And ultimately, he chooses to take the cure.
Right.
As well, is it him or Rogue that chooses to take the cure? I don't remember. I think Rogue chooses to take the cure, and he accepts himself as he is. I think I had them swapped. But all of these stories can be linked as a representation or an allegory for something that's happening in real life. For example, Mystique being forced into a situation where she had to take the cure is conversion therapy. And even though she was very much considered a bad person and evil, you feel for her in that moment because all of her identity is stripped from her forcibly.
Right. Well, and I think that there is a big difference between what we've been talking about in earlier depiction, where the X-Men throughout their entirety were very much an allegorical reflection of the time. And we see this ongoing, allegory to what's happening. Only in recent years does it become overt. And I think this is where conservatives are getting their proverbial panties in a knot. Because it's okay if it's subtext. It's okay because they can ignore it. They can deny it, and they can just say, "Well, this is a story about a fictional group of people experiencing something that really doesn't truly happen because they don't really truly exist." But the moment that the subtext becomes the text, the moment that they become out and woke, when the X-Men becomes filled with, many different experiences of human experience. When you have gay members of, the X-Men, when you have lesbian members or bisexual, you have trans representation and non-binary representation. When you have these individuals in that space and they are openly that way, then the subtext of of what they have represented becomes the outward message of saying, this is what inclusion looks like, this is what acceptance looks like, and this is what we as mutants have faced our entire life. And now conservatives, are losing, getting their proverbial panties in a knot because they can't avoid it anymore. They don't want to have those conversations about political commentary. They don't want to have those conversations about social commentary that is hidden, that is covert and subversive. They don't even know how to read Animal Farm or 1984. They don't know how to read these books that are, Brave New World. They don't know how to read the subject matter that is being used to communicate a bigger message. Yeah. And I know, comic books, these are written for kids. Well, I hate to tell people this, but kids live in a real world.
Well, also, a majority of the people who read comic books are actually adults.
Right, but it is dismissed that
Hmm.
adults are the targets, that adults are involved in this. You know,
Yeah.
going back to the 1930s, the idea of comic books was that they were written to entertain children.
Hmm.
What's interesting is that over the last 11 years, there has been an intentional effort on the part of the comic books industry to push literacy among kids.
Yes.
And that was where the birth of Free Comic Book Day began. They wanted to put comic books in the hands of kids to get them to read again. Because the adult market had swept in, and it was almost exclusively adults who were enjoying comic books. The stories were complex, the characters were complex, the themes were more mature.
Yes.
And so now we are watching, this effort to get kids back into reading these things. But the conservative side wants to say, well, that's just a funny book. That's just a kid's book. It's not actually realistic because kids can't understand that stuff. The fuck they can't. That's part of the reason why kids read comic books. It's not for the flashy costumes.
No.
It is for what is going on in those books. They read the stories, they read the narratives, they don't just look at the pictures.
Yeah. But what you were saying makes a lot of sense when it comes to the subtext becoming the. This is where a lot of conservative people will go, well, why do you need to shove it in our faces?
Mm-hmm.
Why do you need to push it on us? But the funny thing is that it's not any different just because there's a sentence that says, "Oh yeah, this is true." Does not mean that the story has changed. It does not mean that the message of the story has changed. Like you said, Morph was gender fluid in their gender.
Let me spin off of that for 1 minute. Well, it's going to be longer than that because I can't do anything in a minute. But this is coming from personal experience. This is my observation of this group that I'm going to be talking about. Christians don't get allegory. Christians do not understand allegory.
The irony.
Okay? So, first, they carry around a book that is loaded with allegorical imagery, and yet they believe that it is a literal rendering of events. Now, not all of it is allegorical. Some of it is historical in nature. But when something is allegorical, they can't separate that from literal, historical. In addition, when you take something and when Christians try to take the message of Christianity and put it in a contemporary language, in a contemporary medium, it has to be so in your face that you can't avoid it. Case in point, Bible Man. Bible Man was an attempt by conservative Christian groups to take the gospel message and merge it with a comic book hero type.
Oh no.
But what was produced was a caricature of both. Because they don't know how to do the subtlety and the nuance of taking a character, treating it seriously, and bringing in a subtext that supports your message. And one of the
I'll be honest, I
greatest
never heard.
allegorical pieces of Christian literature has been rejected by conservative Christians time and time and time again. C.S. Lewis wrote the Narnia series, and it is loaded with Christian imagery, specifically as a retelling of Christian narratives. And yet, you will find Narnia in the list of bannable books by certain conservative evangelical fundamentalist Christians. Christians don't get allegory. They don't understand allegory. And they are influencing the conservative party right now. The conservative atmosphere of our country is influenced by that lack of ability to understand allegory, to not be able to get a nuanced telling of a story in order to communicate a message that is deeper and more meaningful. So of course not. They can't get comic books. They can't get, that Marvel has been about, civil rights and a message about warmongering, from the very beginning. They can't understand that because allegory escapes their ability to grasp. And the moment we put the subtext in the text, stop shoving that in our face. Well, let me tell you something. I am quite glad that Christians shove in our face their shit, because we can avoid it so much easier. We can find their message without even trying because they trumpet it. And when they try to do subtext, when they try to do a message of subversive indoctrination, it is still so blatant that it is, in fact, overt in its subversive nature.
I can't imagine a mindset where I can't read subtext. I know I struggle with subtext when it comes to personal interactions. I know, I fully admit to that. Sometimes I need the person to explain to me the subtext. But in literature and works of art, I cannot imagine a mindset so dull that you cannot read the allegory.
Yeah.
It's so boring. It's so sad.
Y'all, it is 1 o'clock my time. I'm going to wrap up because I have been on for 3 hours now. Well, yeah, 3 hours and 43 minutes. So I'm going to wrap up, and I'm going to recuperate, also get ready for the news this evening. 5 o'clock Central, I will cover news stories, and you can join in, be a part of that conversation. But I'm actually going to make sure that this is up on YouTube. So if you would like to be a part of this conversation, you can always find it over there. And other than that, I will see you all in a few hours with Transnation News and Talk. Bye, y'all.
Have a good one.